Proverbs. And that's one way to sort of look at the book of Proverbs is to sort of group the Proverbs topically. And that doesn't always work, and there's some slippage between the topics sometimes. But I thought that might be kind of an interesting way to spend some time with some of these Proverbs, because they're not always very contextual, right? Some of the Proverbs just kind of read like a list of Proverbs, just one after the other, and they don't necessarily connect to the verse that comes before or the verse that comes after. So I thought it might be interesting if we spend some time talking about poverty and the poor in Proverbs. We've already seen that mentioned a couple of times. We've already seen poverty as a topic. And so tonight I thought we would just look at a grouping of Proverbs. We might not get to all of them, and that's okay. But I just wanted to group some of these together and let you take a look at them. And this is something, by the way, you can do if you use an online Bible or you use a Bible app. You can type in a word and limit the search to the Proverbs, and you can do exactly what I did with this. You can just sort of come up with a grouping, a topical grouping of the Proverbs on whatever topic you might choose. Speech or speaking or just various things, work or wisdom or whatever. You could come up with a nice topical listing of some of these Proverbs. So anyway, just thought we would give that a try tonight and spend some time talking about poverty, the poor, and Proverbs. So to start with, let's sort of look at some Proverbs that just address some realities of being poor in the world. Because that's what some of these Proverbs do. They don't really have a pronouncement to make one way or the other about poverty. It's just, they just want to say, here's some things that are real for those who are poor. Here's some truth for those who are poor. And it might help us as we read some of these, those of us who do not necessarily struggle with poverty. It might help us to maybe have a little more sympathy, even maybe sort of have a little more understanding of those who are poor, those who do struggle with that, and sort of see what some of what they deal with. So we'll start with Proverbs 10:15. Proverbs 10:15 says, "The wealth of the rich is their fortified city, but poverty is the ruin of the poor." I think we've looked at that one before in a previous class, but it's worth stopping and looking at it again. What's that say?
It's I was saying that that wealth kind of protects people.
Yeah.
It's I don't know, you could maybe use it to buy something, or maybe build a house that has more like it maybe has a fence or wall around it or something like that, whereas a poor person doesn't really have anything. And also with wealth, say there was maybe a kind of a famine or something, and food was scarce, the wealthy would be able to buy it, but the poor person has nothing to even if the food's available, they can't get it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you see in our world is how wealth gives you a margin for error, right? Wealth gives you a cushion. It insulates you a little bit. And the wealthier you are, the farther removed you seem from some of the problems that people in our world, other people in our world deal with regularly. So yeah, it's just this recognition, right, that the poor are kind of on the bleeding edge. They're kind of out there, they're out there in the, on the frontier, and there's not a lot cushioning them from some of the blows that life can bring. And I think that's just always going to be true in our world, right? That wealth gives us some advantages. Wealth gives us some cushion that those who are struggling with poverty don't have. And the proverb doesn't say us, but I think it behooves us to know that, to understand that, to see that's how the world works sometimes.
I think what it's getting at is the issue of security.
Yeah, security. Yeah.
Wealthy people have more security. Yeah. They can have a security system installed in their house. They can build a wall around their house, all kinds of things that the poor, they just don't have.
And metaphorically, a lot of Proverbs is metaphor, right? It's a lot of it is, we're not necessarily talking about actual fortifications, but man, there's a lot of protection that wealth offers.
But it can be a false security.
It can be.
We
Sure.
see that in other things.
Sure.
Jesus probably addressed that a little bit.
It can be, absolutely. It can be a false security.
But I would say it like spiritual wealth versus, is that going too far?
Well, I mean, I think there's truth in that, right? That being spiritually wealthy is an advantage, right? Just like being financially wealthy is an advantage, and so yeah, I think there's absolute truth in that.
That means rich is good, right?
What's that?
That means being rich is good.
Being rich is good. That's interesting.
Good.
Yeah.
Because,
I mean, there's some ways in which being rich is very good, right?
Good, because a sickness that will kill a poor man, that sickness will not kill a rich man.
I'm sorry?
We are all going to the same hospital, but different attendants. Because sickness that I will carry to a hospital that will kill me will not kill a rich man because of his attendance.
Yeah, well, so yeah, there's advantages to being wealthy. Yeah. What were you going to say, Alan?
Jesus says it's very difficult for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven.
He does say that, right?
So there's that.
In which wealth maybe hobbles us. But the proverb isn't really interested in that at this point in time. The proverb has some other things to say about wealth later that we'll look at in poverty. But the point of this proverb is just to say there's advantages to wealth. And there's disadvantages to poverty. And if we know there are disadvantages to poverty, then we know maybe those who are wealthier need to have concern for those who are poor and those who are disadvantaged in that way. A similar one in Proverbs 13:8. A person's riches may ransom their life, but the poor cannot respond to threatening rebukes. What that pictures is somebody being threatened, or there's even like the whole idea in the background of kidnap, the idea of kidnapping someone who's wealthy. And if you're wealthy, guess what? You can pay the ransom and you'll be fine. And if you're poor, you can't. And again, it's the wealth has advantages and poverty has disadvantages. That's there. Here's another disadvantage that we're going to see in several different ways, starting in verse 14. Well, I'm skipping one. I'll come back to it again. Verse 14:20. The poor are shunned even by their neighbors, but the rich have many friends. And there's actually a couple of others like that. Wealth attracts many friends, but even the closest friend of the poor person deserts them. That's Proverbs 19:4. 3 verses later, Proverbs 19:7, the poor are shunned by all their relatives. How much more do their friends avoid them? Though the poor pursue them with pleading, they're nowhere to be found. Chapter 22, we'll look at that. So yeah, there's the recognition that what? Rich people often are more popular. People like to glom on to rich people because, they can help you, they can lift you up, they can slip you a little cash when you're short, they can help you out. Poor people, if you're friends with poor people, guess what? They might need your help. They might ask for some assistance. So it's easier to be the friend of a wealthy person. And again, the proverb is not saying that's good. The proverb is saying that's the way it sometimes is in the world. That's the way sometimes things are, which might tell us as Christians, the poor need friends, right?
Nobody needs that type of friend.
No, nobody needs that type of friend, but the poor need real friends. The poor need people who really care about them and are really concerned about their well-being and really want to help. We all need those kinds of friends.
You can see King Solomon writing something like that, like these lonely fools because they think I can give them
Yeah, sure.
That would be very lonely to come to the realization that nobody really appreciates you for yourself.
Every powerful person deals with that. Every wealthy person deals with that. Do they like me for me, or do they like me for what I can give? Yeah. So there's that whole that again, that's the reality. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's not a good, but that's the way things are in the world with the wealthy and the poor.
Patrick,
Yes, ma'am.
the wealthy should give to the poor because it's a command.
We're going to look in a few minutes at some proverbs that talk a lot about not the way things are, but the way things should be.
Mhm.
The way we ought to treat the poor, the way we ought to be thinking of those who are struggling with poverty. That's going to come up a lot in the Proverbs as well. Yeah. Somebody read 22:7 for us.
22:7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender.
So what is that saying? The rich rule over the poor, the borrower is slave to the lender.
You know, the rich are sustained by the poor.
Okay?
So
And it seems like being rich from this verse, there's power.
Yeah.
They get to be some sort of leader, and not leader in the true sense of the word, but ruling over.
Yeah. Oligarchy, right?
Yes.
the poor have, or the rich often have power. The rich often have that's the strength that their financial security gives them. Influence. And literally in ancient Israel, if you were in debt to somebody, you could wind up as their slave, as a person who was an indentured servant for your debtor. So or for your credit. So there's the while it might be a metaphor, it might also be literal that a rich person could literally find themselves the master of a poor person. The master of this person who's enslaved to debt. And again, the proverb isn't saying that's good. The proverb is saying that's how it is.
And it may even be the intent of the rich person to become the lender.
Yes.
Because of that,
Absolutely.
Slave to me, again, connected with that power.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see how that system could be abused, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like our financial system can be abused. You can see how that can be abused. You could wind up controlling this person. You can wind up with free labor. You can wind up with, and wind up being the person in control of this other human being's life. And so
Patrick,
backbone of feudalism. Yes, correct.
you could theoretically
no,
buy
I was just going to say that you should have a plan in place to be able to repay if you borrow.
Yeah, I wonder that too. If partially this proverb is kind of a caution against a caution on how you enter into debt arrangements. Maybe there's something there that the proverb wants to say about. It ought to make us think sometimes about how much do we want to owe? How much how does our debt control us and make our decisions for us? And we live in a world where debt seems almost for a lot of people, at least most people probably, seems like that's the way it works. But-
But
commonplace, yeah. But maybe that makes us think about, you know, how do I want to organize my life so that I don't find myself caught in this trap that debt can suck you into?
it's kind of a warning.
Yeah, I
Be
mean,
careful about what you borrow.
I think it can certainly function that way.
A mild warning.
Yeah, I think it can certainly function that way. It's kind of a way to make us, bring us up short a little bit, and help us think about.
That should be your last resort, not your first. Most people jump right into debt, and they don't always realize how the interest rate is gonna pile up and keep piling up, and then they end up owing more than they could ever pay back, and then they have to declare bankruptcy or something. Really mess up a person's life.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the idea of, you know, debt is part of our, you know, it's just part of our lives often. But maybe it makes us give it, at least give it a little thought. It's not saying debt's wrong. It's saying the reality is that debt can wind up being your master, can wind up controlling. And that's the way things work. 1823, the poor plead for mercy, but the rich answer harshly. Now that's not saying that's always the case, right? It's just saying that that's often the case. That's often the way it works. The poor are begging for mercy. The rich are too harsh to hear and too harsh to respond with grace and with care and with concern, compassion. But somebody read 28:11 for us as we shift a little bit in our perspective on the rich and the
Rich
poor.
people may think they are wise, but a poor person with discernment can see right through them.
Okay, so now things have changed a little bit, right? The perspective changes a little. This is from a section of the Proverbs that are further Proverbs accumulated by the men of Hezekiah. Seems like Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, years after centuries so after Solomon, set some people to work bringing together more Proverbs. And so this is one from that collection. And in 28:11, it says, the rich are wise in their own eyes. One who is poor and discerning sees how deluded they are. That's the NIV. And I like that translation. The wealthy, why might the rich be wise in their own eyes? What does that mean?
Because they think they're so smart.
They think they're so smart, right? They think they're smart because they live in a world in which what they have done has been rewarded in some way, good or bad. And so they feel like they must be, I'm the best of the best, right? I'm the cream of the crop, or I wouldn't have all this money. I've done it right. I've got all the right answers. I've done the right things. And the proverb says, but even a poor person who's discerning, what is discerning?
I think the poor understand life, the reality of life, than the rich.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And beyond that, discernment usually is a synonym for the kind of wisdom we're talking about in Proverbs. The poor person who seeks after the wisdom of God, he can see right through even this wealthy person. He can see that the wealthy person deludes himself into thinking that just because he's wealthy, he's done it all right. He's
done
got
it all.
So you see how we shift in perspective a little bit from the advantages the rich have over the poor, which are true and numerous and real, to the advantages sometimes the poor might have over the rich, especially in this case. You can see if they're wise, if they're discerning, they can see right through the rich person who is arrogant and feels like he's got it all squared away.
plenty of rich people that haven't done a thing.
Sure,
Born into the right family.
sure. I like the expression, he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple, right? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what's being envisioned here. The person who thinks he's got it all figured out, but even the poor person can look at him and go, how silly, how silly is that? How foolish.
Especially in that society, it makes sense to, your wealth is so stable.
Yeah.
But wealth was in livestock. Those animals could die out in a fight or something.
Nine.
Yeah. Yeah, if your wealth is in, farmland, cropland, right? That's unstable. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean anything that you were wealthy today. And I mean, so so that kind of marks a little bit of a shift. And now we're going to look at some proverbs that probably are the backbone of this whole topic in Proverbs. 29:13. The poor and the oppressor have this in common. The Lord gives sight to the eyes of both. What does that mean for you? The poor and the oppressor have this in common. The Lord gives sight to the eyes of both. You got two different people we're talking about here, or two different categories of people. What are the categories of people we're talking
Good and bad.
about? Okay, the poor and the oppressor. So you've got the person who is at a disadvantage. Who gets oppressed more often than anybody? The poor, right? Because they're easy targets. They can't hire lawyers. They can't, they're easy targets. So they get oppressed when there's oppression happening. And so you have the poor on the one side, the oppressor on the other, and then what they have in common, which is God gives sight to the eyes of both of them. That's a good one for optometrists. So it's
You have to depend on God for sight.
yeah. So it's what they have in common is a God who sustains them. I'm sorry.
They both know what's going on.
Yeah. So they have a God who sustains them, a God who gives them sight, God who gives them life, God who gives them everything. And so, what ought that to do? If you're on one side or the other, if you're the poor, especially if you're the oppressor, what should that make you think? Hold your answer just for a moment until the next one. Proverbs 22:2. Rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. Which is a clearer version, I think, of the one we just read in 29:13. The rich and the poor have something in common. God made them both. Now, if you're poor, that might make you think, maybe I'm just as important as that wealthy person. Maybe I matter just as much as that person who everybody bows down to and everybody wants to befriend. Maybe I matter as much as that person does. And if you're on the other side, if you're the wealthy person, maybe you don't get too proud of yourself in comparison to those who don't have as much. And maybe you realize God cares for them too. God made them as well. It's a leveling kind of understanding, right? It's a realization that I'm not inherently better or worse than someone else on the basis of my financial portfolio. And both sides probably need to hear that sometimes. Proverbs 14:31 then. By the way, please just chime in if something stands out to you. Somebody read 14:31, please.
Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God.
Yeah. And then 17:5 is a similar one. Whoever mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. And then 19:17, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Jesus say anything like that?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the sheep and the goats, right?
Mhm.
And the way you treated the least of these is the way you treated me, God says. And that's how he determines the sheep and the goats, right? Sheep are the ones that treated the least of these with compassion and with love and concern, and kindness. Goats are those who did not. And whatever you did to the least of these, God says, you did it to me. So I think a lot of Jesus' teaching sounds very much like the Proverbs, which I think is interesting and probably not surprising at all. I feel like a lot of his teaching sounds a lot like some of the Proverbs.
What calls the economics of wisdom?
Yeah.
All about economics. Got some of that in there.
Yeah. It reminds us again of what we have in common. God is the maker. Even, the world says rich and poor are very different, right? But our trust in God as our creator says the rich and the poor have something very important in common, a leveling factor that gives the poor greater worth than the world ever will, and that gives the rich a realistic view of their own worth, free of the way we can inflate ourselves because of what we think we've achieved. And twice in two of the Proverbs, 14:31 and 17:5, you have mistreatment of the poor showing contempt for God. You want to be careful about anything that shows contempt for God, right? And the proverb reminds us that this is one of the surer things. I like that. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. That's kind of a neat way to think about it, right? When you lend something to the poor, so they can get by, or you help them in some way. Again, like Jesus says, you've done it for God. Proverbs 22, and 23 is similar. This is from something called the Sayings of the Wise, which is another section of the Proverbs. And they're a little different. A lot of those Proverbs, they don't have the familiar 2-verse or 2-stanza sort of structure that we're accustomed to. And 22 to 23 says, do not exploit the poor because they are poor. Do not crush the needy in court. For the Lord will take up their case and will exact life for life. That reminds me a lot of Jesus talking about those who devour widows' houses, right? And the widow who cries out to a government official for justice in Luke 18, the parable. And this sort of reality in the world of the Old Testament, New Testament too, and our world, that sometimes the poor don't get the justice they deserve. In court, they can be exploited because they are poor.
They can't pay.
They can't pay. In our world, they don't have they don't have an attorney. They don't have money for an attorney that is going to be helpful to them, a high-powered defense guy who can help them, or somebody who can lead their case. They just don't have that. They don't have anybody to speak up. And but the proverb reminds us that the Lord will take up their case when no one else will.
Because the Pharisees did some of that.
Yeah, that's right.
They're known for that.
Devouring widows.
Or the economics of wisdom. Well,
Proverbs 21:13 then. Whoever shuts their eyes to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. What they do to the poor, the way they treat the poor is the way they will be treated, right? They'll cry out and not be answered. What do you think the Proverbs envisioning there? The one who's shut their ears to the cry of the poor will crying out and not being answered. Well, what's he thinking about, do you think? What's he picturing? What's he imagining?
It's portraying that everybody has a need. Even if you are rich, you surely have a need.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I think there's something to that, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
you tend to show no compassion to those in need. Someday it's going to come around to you. Yeah, right. Lazarus at the gate is that it's that plus you have in that you have the idea of eternal judgment, right? Crying out to God and not being answered. I think both those things are in view. I think it's true that we're often treated the way we treat other people. So if somebody comes to you asking for help and this person has has been mean and not willing to show compassion and ungrateful his whole life, it's going to be harder for you to feel good about helping than somebody who has always been there with compassion for someone else. And yeah, I believe that God treats us in that same way, right? The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. That's Proverbs 22:9. And just saying something similar. Let's look at Proverbs 28:8. Somebody read that for us.
Whoever
Income
increases,
from charging high interest rates will end up in the pocket of someone who is kind to the poor.
Well, that's kind of an interesting way to translate that. End up in the pocket of. I kind of like that. NIV says, whoever increases wealth by taking interest or profit from the poor amasses it for another who will be kind to the poor. So under the old law, you weren't supposed to charge interest or excessive interest, depending on how you translate a word. You were supposed to be generous in your terms of those who borrowed from you, especially a brother Israelite, and you were supposed to be generous to them and not see that as a big opportunity to make money off of their misfortune. That was the whole idea, right? If he needs to come and borrow from you, you shouldn't use that as an opportunity to make a lot of money. Now, the whole credit industry in our world revolves around that idea, right? We make money off of debt, but the idea behind it is we don't use poverty, we don't use financial hardship as an opportunity to make money. Sometimes people come to us at church, want to borrow some money, and they'll offer to pay it back with interest. And so far, we've always said no. I think, but we've always said we don't need the interest. But it happened. I mean, we've never collected interest, right? So that we don't use the suffering of someone else as an opportunity to profit, to make money, or to get wealth. So that's sort of the idea behind that, and the idea I think is, if you amass wealth that way, then you're really just holding it for somebody else. After they're kind to the poor, they'll wind up receiving what you have been amassing. It's the idea that ill-gotten gains never last.
But God could also intervene and bring
Yep.
about justice too,
Yep,
in
absolutely.
that period of time. But
Absolutely.
most likely, I think it's saying it's going to go to your relatives, like an inheritance someday, because you won't be able to spend it all.
Yeah, but what's rewarded there in 28:8 is being kind to the poor. That's how you know. And so again, these are all just pointing out the attitude we ought to have, the way we ought to be thinking about wealth and poverty in our world, how we ought to be living our lives and making our decisions based on that. Verse 29:7 is just kind of real clear, right? The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. It's just a very blunt statement about the difference, right? You want to be righteous, you need to have concern for the poor. That's just part of it. And if you don't, there's a different. If you don't have concern for the poor, there's a different adjective that is used to describe you, and that is wickedness. That's not saying you're irredeemably wicked if you've ever forgotten the poor. It's a way of talking about this is what we aspire to, right? This is the kind of life, the kind of wisdom we aspire to living by. We want to be righteous. If we want to be righteous, then that means, among other things, being concerned with the poor, giving justice to the poor. What is justice? We should talk about that for a minute. What is justice in Proverbs? We use the term almost exclusively to talk about, he received justice for his crimes, right? That means what?
It's a reconciliation.
Sorry, what then?
Usually means punishment.
Punishment is what it usually means. Justice usually means he received justice for his crimes. Usually means he got a sentence that we think is worthy of what he's done.
An appropriate deterrent.
An appropriate deterrent, right? Yeah. We however we describe it, however we define appropriate, that's what justice is to us.
It's wrong.
Fairness.
It's fairness in the proverb, in the prophets, in the Old Testament. When you talk about justice, what you're talking about is right treatment, fair treatment, equitable treatment. Sometimes that's going to mean punishment when punishment is due, right? And the person who's hurt you doesn't get off because he's wealthy and can pay a bribe, right? But it also can mean just treatment that is equitable, treatment that's appropriate to the situation, appropriate to whatever you're going through. Matt, did you?
Well, that's not how I would define it either, because if we did that, there'd be no need for justice. I think justice is a remediation of the imbalance that wrong creates in the world. That's how God seems to view it.
Yeah.
It's making things whole again after they've been warped.
Yeah, I'll take that. Remediation. Yeah, making things whole again. Yeah.
Yeah, we all did right from the beginning.
Yeah.
You draw parallels in sermons that really use justify.
Yep.
In Microsoft Word, and it brings that definition home.
Yeah. To justify your margins when you're doing a word processing document, right? You've got everything's brought to the standard, everything's brought to as it should be. So that's what we're driving at. And in the case of the rich and the poor, justice has to do with this fair treatment. The poor aren't necessarily. It's not easy for the poor to find fair treatment in the courts sometimes. Fair treatment in situations of when there's a dispute one way or the other. It's the wealthy who often have that advantage. Remember, we talked about some of the advantages the wealthy have. But yeah, so if you're a righteous person and you're concerned that the poor get justice, that matters to you. We'll look at Proverbs 31 later, but the wife of noble character toward the end of chapter 31, the second half of chapter 31, one of the qualities is that she opens her arms to the poor She extends her hands to the needy. It's a very vivid picture of this welcoming, right? She welcomes those who are poor. She's there for them. She's really willing to offer compassion. And we're all supposed to aspire to that. Let's look at a few others here. And some of these kind of offer a little bit of a contrast. 19:1, better the poor whose walk is blameless than a fool whose lips are perverse. What does that mean? But sort of ranking what it's better to be, right? and if you got to choose, it's better to be somebody who's poor, but who lives life in a blameless way, who pursues this wisdom that we're talking about, than a person who is foolish, who disdains wisdom. You don't want to be that guy. You'd rather be the poor guy than the fool. Whatever the fool's financial situation, you're better off, he says, as a poor guy. Now, in our world, people might say, I don't know about that. I think I'd rather be a rich fool than a straight guy who's a guy on the straight and narrow who's poor. But the Proverbs says, no, that's not what you want to be. The poor whose walk is blameless over the fool whose lips are perverse. Almost the same thing in 28:6. Proverbs 19:22. What a person desires is unfailing love. This is one that's a little hard to translate, but the second line is particularly punchy. Better to be poor than a liar. Remember, we've seen that for Proverbs, poverty isn't great. There's problems with poverty. There's disadvantage with poverty. But it's better to be poor than to be a liar. It's better to be poor than to be a fool. If there's wisdom, if you have wisdom, if you are pursuing this wisdom of God. Hezekiah and the sayings of King Lemuel both pull together some proverbs about rulers, which is not surprising, right? And Proverbs 28:3 says, a ruler who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain that leaves no crops. Let's think about that one for a minute. Let's talk about that one for a minute. A ruler who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain that leaves no crops. What's being said there? What's rain supposed to do? It's supposed to help the crops, right? But if you got a driving rain that just, drowns them all and washes them away, washes away the topsoil, washes away the crops that have been planted, then that rain that was supposed to help the crops doesn't do any good. It's useless. So how is that like a king who oppresses the poor or a ruler who oppresses the poor?
Well, a king is supposed to bless his people.
There you go. The ruler is
Instead of
supposed
beating them down.
the ruler is supposed to bless the people he rules, and especially those who are most marginalized and most suffering. He's especially supposed to be concerned about them. So it's like a rain that's supposed to help the crops that washes them away when the ruler doesn't help the poor. When he's more concerned about the rich and about currying favor and about consolidating power and all of that. He ought to be out on the lookout, especially for those who are on the margins. And then 29:14 says, if a king judges the poor with fairness, his throne will be established forever. I think that's a picture of God cementing in place the dynasty of a person, of a ruler who cares for those who are and judges them with fairness instead of with. That doesn't mean the poor get everything they want all the time, right? It means they're judged with fairness. They're treated with justice. They're treated on equal footing with those who in justice situations with those who have money, those who are wealthy. And so the sayings of King Lemuel in 31:8-9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Because again, they don't necessarily have a lot of friends flocking to defend them, right? They need some help. And so if you're that king, if you're in that position of power and influence, you speak up for those who can't speak for themselves.
And if he does that, Patrick, he probably would stay on his throne longer.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah. Yeah. The peasants are revolting, right? I always like this one, 37-9. 2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. I think there's a lot in there, and I really like it. It says, you know, you can have too much, maybe. You know, contrary to what we say in our world, it's possible maybe to have too much. It's possible to just accumulate and gain until you've lost all sense of proportion and all sense of what's right and all sense of need for God. There's this sort of idea that you can become so arrogant in your own accomplishment that you even forget you need God. What you referenced a minute ago, Alan, that it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom. Why is it so hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom? Well, because all that wealth gets in the way sometimes.
They're too self-sufficient.
Yeah. There are reasons why it's hard for a poor person to enter the kingdom too, but it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom because of the way wealth can make us self-sufficient and arrogant and think that we don't need anything. We're doing fine. Yeah. But then on the other hand, he says, but don't make me so poor that I might be tempted to steal. And in doing that, I would dishonor God. So on both sides, it's about God, right? Honoring what will honor God, what will honor Him. That's what's the important thing when we talk about wealth, we talk about riches, right? How are we going to honor God with what we have, and how are we going to honor God even in our lack sometimes? How are we going to lift Him up? You know.
Go get it. By my medicine.
Let me leave you just some time to, any comments you want to make or any thoughts in the last couple of minutes here.
Sleeping and drowsiness.
Yeah. So that comes up quite often in the Proverbs. Sleeping and drowsiness. That's one you might want to do a search for sometime. The 2013. Do not love sleep or you'll grow poor. Stay awake and you'll have food to spare. Now, we all need to sleep sometimes, right? That's not the point. But the point is that laziness, the idea of I won't work. I just want to stay in bed. I just want to enjoy my slumber and just relax and take life easy. Similar as 21:17. Whoever loves pleasure will become poor. Whoever loves wine and olive oil will never be rich. The idea being, right, that why olive oil? We're sort of, teetotalers. We sort of get the wine thing, right? But why olive oil? What's the problem with olive oil?
It was expensive.
It's expensive. And that's the thing with wine too, by the way. It's not saying you should never drink wine. What it's saying is pursuing the pleasure of food and drink excessively will bankrupt you, wipe you out. You'll wind up being rich. It's an idea of moderation, seeking of pleasure. Proverbs also will say that wine and oil are a sign of God's blessing, because God's made you productive, made your fields and your groves productive. But vineyards, but yeah, you can to love pleasure excessively, to seek after the finer things all the time is to court disaster. Well, so now all you know all about poverty and riches. Hope you enjoyed kind of going through some of those and spending some time with them. I think they offer us some perspective on how we think about money, and how we think about wealth, and how we think about poverty. We don't want to glamorize poverty. The Proverbs don't do that, right? But the Proverbs do say that God is concerned about the poor, and that if we're going to be righteous, we should be concerned about the poor as well.
Proverbs teaching us what God takes seriously.
Yep.
That's the poor.
Yeah.
It's said that over and over in many different areas of the Bible.
Yeah, right. Comes up pretty often, doesn't it?
Kind of drill that in us, I think.
All right. Well, good to see everyone.
Good night, guys.
Thank you, Patrick. Good
Have a
night,
great
everybody.
evening.
Good night.
Everyone.
Thanks for your thoughts. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
I just love Proverbs. I love so funny. If you